What was life like in the 70s, 80s, and 90s? Story 1. A ton of people smoked cigarettes, and they smoked them darn near everywhere. Non-smoking sections in restaurants were frequently just a different section when the whole place would be filled with smoke. I loved how corner or grocery stores and many other businesses would have at least one arcade machine. Walking into a store to either hear someone playing or hearing the game's demo provided a fun atmosphere that's largely gone these days. Payphones were all over the place. It was awesome when I was like 16 with a pager. I could just say I couldn't find a payphone when my parents were looking for me. Coordinating with people was much more difficult, of course. Like, someone would be really late for something, holding everyone up, and no one had a clue what was going on. A lot of time was spent waiting for things. I first got my hands on the NES shortly after its release, and living through that age in gaming was so awesome. My friends and I had a meeting place where if they needed my help in a game, they'd be there at a certain time. There was a lot of that. Like, if you went to a concert with someone, it was important to designate a meeting place if you get split up. The release of new media like songs or movies was so much more exciting, as options were more limited. You either went to the movies or you had a handful of channels on TV, but visiting rental places was fun. Late at night, basically nothing but infomercials would be on. The old school light bulbs emitted a fair amount of heat. If you went to a theater performance, there'd be this huge furnace-like bulb to light the stage, making everyone sweat. And just my experience, but if you walked past a person, you'd generally say hi, perhaps because it felt awkward not to acknowledge their presence, not having anything else to occupy your attention. I remember the shift when phones or tech made us start looking down and nod at each other. It really was a different world back then. I remember going to a restaurant as a kid and they asked if we wanted smoking or non-smoking. We said non-smoking and they sat us at a table and just took the ashtray away. I'm glad that we agreed that smoking in public places is bad as a country in the 2000s, before every issue got hyper-politicized. If this were a hot debate in today's political culture, I'm sure some states would be expanding the number of places where you're allowed to smoke and banning the existence of non-smoking sections. Yeah, the smoking thing is particularly interesting to me, because nowadays most people have largely wised up to its dangers, and I don't see a lot of people using cigarettes in public anymore. I'm glad I can go to a restaurant without having to sit in a cloud of someone else's cigarette smoke. Story 2. It was quiet. I don't want to sound like a boomer, but it was really quiet. People spent more time just being outdoors and reading and sitting around not doing much. You couldn't just dial up whatever you wanted on a streaming service. If you wanted to learn something, you had to go to a library. There were even people at the library who were sort of a human Google. You'd ask them a question and they'd go find the answer. Correspondence was slower. You mailed things physically. You had to keep track of things like bank accounts and bills manually with pencil and paper because you couldn't just look up your balance. Parents weren't around as much. Kids came home from school and made themselves a snack, then got on their bikes and left. It was more be home by dinner and just like trust your kids would come back home. The world was smaller too. You knew about your town, your friends, maybe your family if they were close, and that was about it. You certainly didn't know what a celebrity was eating or what a guy in China was walking around doing all day. As a kid in the 80s and 90s, I remember ordering things that would literally take 6 to 8 weeks to arrive, and when they did, it was a big deal. Same thing with getting a new magazine in the mail every month. That was also exciting. The idea of something like Prime or 2-day shipping as an automatic thing would have seemed insane. There were FedEx commercials back then about their new overnight service, and it was seen as rare and revolutionary. Prime or 2-day shipping has reduced the availability of some things too, though. For example, as a teenager, I used to ride my bike to a typical suburban strip mall and walk into a Radio Shack, where they had 3 aisles each full of bins and drawers, all taller than me, and each drawer was full of tiny parts to make any hobby or toy or project. Resistors, relays, tiny light bulbs, little 3-way switches, knobs, whatever. Anything you could ever want to make something cool. You could buy it right then and take it home. There's nothing like this today. You have to go on the internet, and if you're lucky, you might be able to have it tomorrow, but more likely in 3 to 5 days. I've always thought of Amazon as nothing but a good thing for supply and demand, but I too have noticed that things are less and less available in store because you can find them online. It does suck having to wait those 3 to 5 days for a tiny item you could have just picked up immediately at a shop back in the day. Story 3. I grew up in horse country in New Jersey in the 70s. We had 13 acres of fields and barns, a big farmhouse, tractors, go-karts, mini bikes, and snowmobiles. My sister had a pickup truck at age 15 that always had a bale of hay in the back, because then it qualified as a farm truck and she was allowed to drive it. Two of my neighbors were on cow farms. One was raising beef, one was a milk farm. We rarely contacted each other in any other way than visiting. If you wanted to see what your friend was doing, you hopped on your mini bike or ATV or whatever and rode over there. CB radios were the only real long-range communication other than a phone. When I was old enough, I bolted an antenna to the top of the house, and I have great memories of talking with my friend 2 miles away while we were watching the same TV show. That was exciting. The 80s were wild and exciting. Technology was kicking it. This was still pre-internet, but bulletin board systems were the way to live and die. Logging in to see what people have said online in the last few days was nifty. I ran a BBS on an Apple II clone that had a group of 25 or so localish people, long-distance charges were a thing, and every once in a while we'd have a party and everyone would meet in person. That was crazy. I went to a lot of rock concerts. A short list is Pink Floyd, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, Jethro Tull, Moody Blues, Boston, Bon Jovi, Grateful Dead, my first, Genesis, Billy Joel, and Talking Heads. Printed catalogs were absolute king. Computer Shopper was a catalog that was hundreds of pages thick and was the equivalent of browsing eBay in print form. You could find just about anything in there. Compared to today, the biggest change is not having all the world's knowledge at your fingertips. You could argue for hours about whether the little kid says, "Look, mummy, there's no plane up in the sky," and have a dozen opinions, and there was no way to tell unless someone had the album or tape or whatever, and then you'd still argue. Rand McNally Road atlases were fun as heck. I have in my hand a map of all the roads in the US. We can go anywhere. I still enjoy not knowing something and just wondering about it. Google is not a good way to interact with questions. How many tablespoons per gallon? After the coronal discharge takes out all electronic communication, I'll still have my encyclopedia. How about you? Some of the things OP mentions here were complete mysteries to me, like bulletin board systems, or BBS. I literally had to Google it to find out what they were. Ironic. Story 4. I grew up in a poor province of a third world country. The 90s in my village were not fun. My family lived below the poverty line, just like more than half of the country's population. We were not starving, but having to skip a meal was not rare, and meat was a luxury. My village did not have running water, so it was my job to carry water from the well back home. We shared a toilet for the whole commune, which was just a hole in the ground. Fun fact, I did not live in a house with a modern toilet until I was already a man. We had electricity for 2 or 3 hours per day, if we were lucky. So of course, no one had appliances like AC, washing machine, or fridge. Most houses only had a few light bulbs, a fan or two, and a radio. One house had a 14-inch black and white TV, and they were very popular. We would gather at their house to watch the news every evening around 7 to 9 p.m., which was generally when we had electricity. Traveling was a huge pain. The best most of us could afford was a bicycle. If you owned a bike, then you were rich, and cars were a myth for us children. Some of my relatives moved away, and it was hard to visit each other. We also had like 1 or 2 phones for the whole village. A cell phone may as well have been a replicator. When someone called us, the phone owner would tell them to call back in 5, run to our houses, and tell us to come with them. But at least it was still better than the 80s or 70s. I did not experience those times personally, but we had a war that killed millions of our countrymen. Then embargo, hunger, and social unrest. I'm grateful that things improved so much throughout the last 3 decades. My children can now live a life that me or my parents didn't even dare to dream of back then. For clarification, I'm from Southeast Asia, but I moved to Japan a decade ago. My family escaped Laos during the Vietnam War. My parents brought my brother and I back in 1990, then 96, and I went back for the first time as an adult in 2010. All I could remember is how Vientiane was back in the 90s. Dirt roads and trees. Because everything was dirt or clay roads, the whole city looked a little orange. My family wasn't poor, but it still looked like they lived in poverty compared to what I was used to. When I went back in 2010, I couldn't believe how much had changed. There were paved roads and all kinds of cars, not just bicycles and mopeds, even Ferraris and Bentleys. The rich got super rich and the poor even poorer. Suddenly, my family had houses 2 or 3 times bigger than ours here. I've been back 3 times since 2010 and I'm still blown away by how much it's changing. Meanwhile, my wife's family also comes from Laos and live in the country. My father-in-law's family lives up in the hills and has limited electricity, like you once did. Hey, this is something I can definitely relate to. I was stuck in Japan for 3 3 years due to COVID, and when I visited earlier this year, the change was insane. Even the street vendors accept cashless payments now. And thanks for reminding me of the dirt/clay roads. My country was the same, and my childhood memory also has an orange tint to it. Story 5. There was a certain sense of optimism, in the 90s at least. I was only a child, but even then I could feel a general consensus amongst people that things were okay or mellow, maybe. Not to mention there was a prevailing excitement that we were building up to an entirely new millennium. So I think everyone had this hope that good things were waiting behind that door. The end of war, the end of poverty, sickness, and what have you. The 20th century had been hell. 2 world wars, Vietnam, the Cold War, people were ready to see something better, and for a brief while we did. Then 9/11 happened, and it all went belly up. Yep, I too remember that optimism of the 1990s. Things were definitely looking up. Then a couple of planes smashed into the World Trade Center, the war on terror started, and it all went pear-shaped. Maybe it's because I was a young kid, but I do remember the 90s being pretty peaceful. My parents were visibly less worried about current events and world news. Now I'm lucky to go 1 week without them sending me some video or article on the next thing I need to be worried about. Story 6. I was 9 years old in '89, so the 90s encapsulated my entire teen years. It was great. It had an easy, stress-free feel to it. The music culture was still very alive, and we had some great music. We didn't have cell phones or social media, so I could leave the house and no one would know where I was unless I wanted them to. Thank God I didn't have a cell phone. I got in enough trouble with a disposable camera. I can only imagine how that would have gone with a cell phone and social media. I had a pager and I thought it was so cool. My pager message included the word, "What up?" because, I was cool. The only pressure I had to conform to beauty standards came from 17 magazine and Cosmopolitan, not Instagram. The 90s were a gem, and most of us didn't realize it while we were in it. That being said, enjoy your decades. Who knows which one will be the next 90s, and you'll miss it too if you're not paying attention. The 90s were the peak of civilization in my opinion. There were far fewer distractions like social media and streaming, but we still had computers and good TV. Saturday morning cartoons, building bike ramps, riding ATVs everywhere, way more freedom. Story 7. After Saturday Night Live was over at midnight, Monty Python was on PBS. There was nothing worthwhile to keep my brother and me up after that, so there was no reason to stay up past 12:30. In the 80s and earlier, network TV would just shut off at around 1:30 a.m. Some stations had little sign-off messages or they'd play the national anthem, and then there would just be static overnight until New Zoo Review came on at 6 a.m. or whatever. This was always a trip, and a warning when I stayed up too late. I'd have literally 20 seconds to turn off the TV before things went full poltergeist. I think it was a good thing that TV just stopped at a certain point in the night back then. Nowadays, the temptation to stream Netflix into the wee hours of the morning is too strong. Story 8. I was born in '84, so I don't remember much of the '80s, but I remember all of the '90s. It felt like a simpler time. You actually had to wait for things. You couldn't just buy whatever from Amazon. I remember my parents had an actual checkbook with a register that they recorded their transactions in. As an adult, I don't know how they did it. By the time I had my own bank account, I could view everything online. In my neighborhood, we still had a little corner store where you could buy penny candy. Everything seemed really peaceful. I had a great childhood in the '90s. I miss going to the store just to browse games, movies, and albums. And probably not just one store, but going through every store in a mall that sells those things, comparing selections and prices, and maybe finding something in the bargain bin, and then going home to consume that thing the same day. Nowadays, I can get everything on the computer immediately, but can't decide what to choose and end up doing nothing. There is little reason to go to a store unless you already know what you're buying, and that's one of the reasons I rarely leave the house. Story 9. The music was excellent. The food options were what your mom cooked or not. If your mom wanted or cared to know where you were, she just looked down the street to see which yard all the bikes were in. You were allowed to come back in the house only when the street light came on. And I say light because my mother had to buy a street light to put in our backyard. There were no lights on our street. If you traveled by car overnight, the kids slept in the back. The oldest kid got the back seat, the middle got the floorboard, and the youngest, me, got to sleep on the rear dash. You collected the green bottle Coca-Cola bottles. The big ones were worth 10 cents and the small ones were worth 5. So 2 big ones and 1 small would get you a quarter, which was enough for another Coke and a candy bar. When we were thirsty, we drank out of the hose. If you heard a snippet of a song, say you heard a bit on the AM radio while way out of broadcast range, you had to remember the song and hope someone would recognize it when you described it. It once took me 4 years to find one. If you wanted to make a mixtape, you clicked record on a handheld recorder recorder in front of a speaker and prayed that the DJ didn't speak over the intro. We played all day long without parental supervision. We biked for miles. At 12, I walked down the road with a .22 and my friend with a 12 gauge, and the only thing any adult said to us was, "Be careful." We walked or cycled everywhere. You got a new bike every Christmas, and it was usually torn down and rebuilt by February. We had to know how to change our own chains, change our own bearings, and balance our own wheels. That was just to name a few, and the bonus, there was no video evidence of the stupid things we did. Yep, born in 1960, and this could be my childhood. Actually, it was exactly my childhood. Thanks for reminding me. So much nostalgia. On another note, this thread is just a long list of illegal things, which nowadays would cancel the parents and make the kids celebrity victims. It's not all bad though. I'm glad indoor smoking is no longer a thing. Story 10. Gen X guy here, and from my experience, it was a beautiful time to grow up. I grew up on the West Coast in Southern California. There was lots of freedom and no internet to distract you. We were always outside playing football in the street, hitting baseballs at the park, or skateboarding all over the place with no cell phones for parents to constantly track us. This forced us to be self-reliant. In summer, we'd ride our bikes to the beach and ride waves all day. We'd listen to music on our radios which everyone would hear, not just individually on our earbuds isolated in your own world. I miss those days, and as a father of middle schoolers, I wish they could have experienced it. The cell phone and internet was a nuclear bomb that screwed up the way kids grow up. Just my opinion. I love the internet, GPS, mobile phones, etc., but I'm also grateful I grew up without any of it. All we had was early video games, which kind of sucked, so we went outside and did stuff. I'd totally be glued to an iPad 24/7 if I grew up now. My first real job was running vacation routes for sales guys in towns I'd been to before, with no GPS. I'd show up at 5 a.m. on Monday and follow their crappy handwritten notes and directions for the next week. It was stressful, but also kind of fun. I didn't make crap, but I also rented an entire house with a roommate for $600. Story 11. One thing that always stuck out to me as a difference between mine and my kids' childhoods is the idea of leaving a note. Like if you were going somewhere or doing something, you had to leave a note, and God help you if you didn't. Leaving notes, passing notes in class, getting a note from the friend of the girl you thought was cute asking if you liked her or not. I totally miss all of that. I remember passing notes in middle school, despite having a cell phone, though it was probably because we paid per text back then. Story 12. In the 70s, I was just a kid, so I sailed through it. That said, the clothes and shoes were wild. I was a teenager through the 80s and the music was way better, but for a time it was scary as heck, with the threat of nuclear annihilation. We had a 3-minute warning siren around a couple of 100 meters away, and they tested on a Sunday afternoon every 2 months. That really helped with the nervous tension, along with the government information films and documentaries on what to do. I missed the Berlin Wall coming down due to alcohol and the opposite sex. In the 90s, the music was even better, but all of a sudden I had responsibilities. Story 13. You didn't have the constant buzzing of social media in your ear, telling you that if your friends don't agree with you 100% of the time, they are toxic and that you should leave them, and that, in return, leaves you feeling lonely because no one is going to agree with you 100% of the time. Instead, your friend group was usually made up of a bunch of different people with different opinions that you could get into fights with, but you would make up later on as you worked out your issues. Everyone went through this, so the idea of being sad and feeling lonely because your friendships weren't this fantasy of perfection did not exist. This one resonates with me. I did high school in the early to mid-90s. My friend group was all over the place, and we had plenty of conflict among us, but remained friends. I don't think people are any different today, at their core, but growing up with the internet from the early 90s to where we are today, there is no missing the way it's changed society. People just seem way more insecure now. I'm not talking financially, which is another story, but on a personal core character level, and I believe it has a lot to do with social media exposing everyone to all of this manufactured crap people push on their social media, trying to look like life is perfect and/or gain clout. A heck of a lot of people do not even look like their online image in reality. That and the way online activity seems to inevitably devolve into echo chambers that foster societal division and broadcast it to the world. Reddit is the perfect example, a site to build around the concept of creating bubbles of echo chambers. It's a fantastic vehicle of radicalization. We are more connected than ever before in human history, and yet we are becoming increasingly divided. It's strange. Story 14. In the 90s, being a kid was interesting. Communities seemed more cohesive and people seemed more aware of what was going on locally. That didn't always mean that they did the right thing, but things didn't feel as disconnected as they feel now. As far as being a kid, well, it was fun but insanely materialistic. Some of the fads and obsessions that arose in the 90s got stupid crazy, and while there is some nostalgia for it, most of it has been forgotten or become worthless. In some ways, I think 2000s kids had it slightly better, even if they didn't get the amazing cartoons we had. There was such an insane brand obsession, and it truly defined how you got treated by other kids. I remember asking for clothes for birthdays and Christmas because it was the only way I could get branded items. My mom would buy everything at the outlet mall, so I had the right brands, but they were always one season behind, and I still got picked on for that. Story 15. I was born in 1980. As a small kid in the 80s, I remember how exciting cartoons, action figures, and movies were, which I guess is pretty typical for kids. I literally had a kid's record player and got a cassette/radio one year, which was very cool. The world as a whole seemed larger and distances seemed greater. In the 90s, I remember the increasing use of computers, but even when I graduated high school in 98, a lot of people didn't even have computers in their homes. Some did, but it wasn't ubiquitous. As far as pop culture, most of it was still driven by cable TV, radio, video stores, theaters, and magazines. The sense of culture was more universal, since there wasn't as many avenues available as there are now. Finding rare movies, shows, and music was harder because it had to be a physical copy you shared, which made finding it more exciting. Socially, there was less of a fear of missing out, or FOMO, because we weren't constantly online and social media didn't exist, so whatever you were doing at the time with whoever you were with was what you were focused on. Cell phones were still pretty rare in the 90s. The most people often had was a pager. Long-distance phone calls were still expensive. Politically, things really took a turn after 9/11, and we lost a lot of optimism that was present in the 90s. Looking back at the poor choices our leaders made during the 80s makes me understand the fallout we're experiencing now. Culturally, there was much less representation of diversity in the 80s and 90s, and unfortunately, a good amount of that representation was still based in stereotypes and caricatures. Overall, I'm glad to be living in the present, as complicated as it is. I was born in the same year. This is pretty much my same experience. Did you have a book of CDs? I remember having a clip-on one that was on the visor of my crappy high school car. Yes, I had a few booklets that I kept under the passenger seat of my car that would slide out when I had to stop fast. Luckily, my Discman had skip protection. Story 16. Born in 83 here, so early millennial. I can't remember too much of the 80s. It sort of folds into one blur of childhood, but I can remember things like my grandparents being young, my parents in their 20s and playing outside a lot. The TV and music were great. We had Transformers and Shoe People and Raggy Dolls and stuff like that. I remember primary school and the summers seeming endless. I remember my dad won £3,000 on the football pools at some point as well. This was loads of money back then. He bought a new car and paid off part of the mortgage. The 90s seemed like an amazing time. I can remember going out and playing with my friends, literally saying to my mom, "See you later," picking up my bike and going off to find my friends, and not coming home till later. I had to knock on their doors to see if they were free to play and talk to their parents. I remember building dens and going exploring, stuff like that. I can remember going swimming for a quid. It was 90p to get into the pool, leaving 10p for the locker. And once I got that back, I used the 10p for a Chomp chocolate bar from the vending machine. The video games were amazing. We started with the SNES and finished with the PS1 and N64. Meeting up at a friend's house to play GoldenEye is a defining memory. Kids didn't have phones and things just felt safer. Plans were made to meet up rather than texting. I can remember things not being so money-oriented. We weren't well off but survived on just my dad's wage and even got to have a holiday. Not abroad though, once a year. TV was good. There was no streaming or on demand, so you'd make sure you were home to watch the show you wanted or you'd miss it. Kids' TV was good. Stuff like Ninja Turtles, Power Rangers, and Captain Planet, and the tail end of Transformers too. I can remember getting the internet at home for the first time. It was completely different from today, with no social media, loads of different search engines. I can remember my IT teacher telling me Alta Vista would be the big one. Online gaming was expensive for me, but I still managed to be in a Quake clan. Politically here in the UK, things felt like they were changing for the better. I was getting into my teens at the end of the 90s and learning about politics. It was the era of new labor and cool Britannia Britpop and all that sort of stuff. There was positivity everywhere that things were changing for the better. Not everything was about making as much money as possible, and social programs were put in place to increase education and for people to better themselves. It really did feel like we were on the cusp of something good, kind of like you are living in the future as you got towards the year 2000. It all changed with 9/11 though. The world has been a darker place since. One last thing I can remember weirdly is there seemed to be a lot more birds back then. I can remember the skies being full of them when I was a kid. I just looked out my window and realized I've not seen a single one in the sky. There was definitely a huge change after the early 2000s. I think 9/11 was obviously a huge part of it, but I think in the UK at least, over a decade of conservative government and austerity measures is a big part of it too. Everything just feels a bit grim, and I really miss the optimism and freedom of the 90s and early 2000s. And there are definitely less birds and insects. I find it interesting how many individuals here have mentioned 9/11 as a significant turning point in the world, even for non-Americans. I can honestly say I didn't expect that when I originally started reading this thread. Story 17. The biggest thing for me is that there was less negativity. I'm not saying people are negative, but technology has allowed for almost unfiltered news updates and videos. And while a lot are very sweet and positive, there is an almost constant influx of negative information. Story 18. Everything was in person, shopping, banks, etc. You spent more time running errands, but it was nice because going from place to place in person, you got to know people. And if you had a problem, somebody is or knows a friend that could help. On the flip side, if you were not up in time, you would miss the plan for the day from your friends and spend most of the day riding your bike around trying to find them. I was an 80s kid. I realized the other day that when I move from where I live now, absolutely nobody will know or care other than my immediate neighbors. Just from those in-person errands you mentioned, I knew half the town as a kid and younger adult. The mechanic at the gas station, the waitress at the diner, the bartender who was there for life because it was a good job that paid for a house. The same bug man came to our house for decades, and I knew his kids in school. The same soda man delivered pop by the case for my entire life. The neighbor girls who babysat until we both hit puberty, and the relationship changed for the better. I knew the pastor and his whole family, and made out with his daughter at a church camp in the forest. I knew every neighbor for probably 3 blocks around. All the usual bad and sad things still occurred, as they always do in life, but the majority of my time was spent enjoying myself. Even work was fun because that was another family. We even had a bowling league. Story 19. I was 12 in 1979, and disco was coming to an end. We used to go to this local dance thing every Saturday afternoon, and I got to see what life as a preteen was all about. There were a lot of similar activities that people do today, but the Atari 2600 and cable TV and VCRs sort of got us back inside. I remember parents having us go outside for a play break, and then back to asteroids. The 80s was more of a preppy mall culture. MTV was huge. We worried about Russia and AIDS. I met my girlfriend in 1984 and watched Live Aid. We've been married for 33 years. The 90s were tricky because I was drunk for a while, got sober in 96, and had 2 kids just as grunge was going away. I liked Extreme Championship Wrestling and Tower Records. 1999 ended with us worrying if the world was going to glitch out. It didn't. I remember the preppy mall culture completely. I remember that a good number of teen films from the 80s would have mall or shopping sequences in them, similar to the obligatory guitar solo in songs. Remember Night of the Comet? It was a post-apocalyptic zombie movie that still found a way to work in a mall shopping scene. Story 20. Opinions and attitudes that were broadcast or distributed to the masses were all modified through a mature adult perspective, which means that young people were more exposed to thinking and ideas that had some semblance of life experience, emotional maturity, and long-term thinking to back them up. Young people today exist in a world of media, which lacks maturity of thought and behavior. Kids are taking counsel from other immature people, which tends to validate their adolescent notions of the world. I think it is badly stunting young people and leading them to hold immature ideas for much longer than earlier generations. Story 21. Life was easier in the 90s. We didn't have all this technology in the palm of our hands destroying social skills, handwriting skills, spreading hate easier, invading your privacy, the vast amount of scams, and the insane amount of online bullying. I would rather use a phone like an old Nokia, but they won't work on our networks. Whilst technology does help us advance with knowledge in some areas, in others we are getting dumber. You sound like the old people that we used to make fun of when we were kids in the 90s. Life truly does come full circle. Thanks for watching and/or listening all the way to the end. happened? Do you have a similar story that you'd like to share? Or if you weren't alive in the 70s, 80s, or 90s, but it sounds interesting to you, tell us about it in the comments below. Do you wish you were a kid back then? We'd love to hear about it. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe. For more videos like this one right now, please stop by our channel. Thanks again, and see you next time.